Digital Health Economics. Does it make sense? Moderated by Dr. Stefan Buttigieg, Digital Health Malta. With Dr. Shruti Jayakumar, Deloitte. JP Fabri, Seed. And Dominick Kennerson, G4A Digital Health Partnerships.
Digital health economics. Does it make sense? And you've all been introduced, so I'm not going to go into it. I'm going to dive in to the questions that I have for all of you. So, like many times, when we have a digital health project, it's very difficult to communicate the value of that project, especially in financial sense. How shall we solve that? Any tips and tricks there? Maybe we can start off, ladies first. Guys, come on. Shruti, please, go ahead.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's a real pleasure. So what I will start off by saying is, it's a really long subject. We could probably talk for hours and hours. But I think the first thing is to break it down into the different aspects of digital health. And it's such a broad field. You have AI, you have EHR, you have remote monitoring, you have telemedicine, you have a whole host of things. And with each of those areas, there are lots of sort of little sort of tips and tricks that are unique to them. So I think the area that's probably most interesting or has the most sparks a lot of conversation is AI. And I think within that, it can be really difficult, as you say, to really get value because we're pouring so much money in. AI maturity in hospitals, especially now, is still quite poor.
Yeah, it's quite new, huh?
Sorry?
It's quite new, huh?
Yes, exactly. So what we have to really look at is what real-world outcomes we're achieving. So a lot of these studies are in labs. When I say labs, they're kind of simulations on a computer. And so we need trials. If we're rolling out a drug, we're rolling out a new device for an operation, we'll go through a randomized controlled trial process. We'll compare what the standard is right now and then against the new thing that we're developing, and we'll come up with a series of outcomes that we've predefined. And unfortunately, in AI, we're not quite there yet. And I think that makes it very difficult to say, okay, well, how effective is this? And I think the second point is a lot of current AI models that are actively deployed are to do with workflow processes, so reducing clinician burden. So my background is I was a doctor before I joined Deloitte, and a lot of these processes were aimed at making my day-to-day job faster or reducing some of the tasks so I could focus on patient care. Now, the way that the financial sense for that is calculated is often just a function of salary. So they say, okay, well, I've saved 8 hours of the doctor's time, and this is how much they get paid in a year, so I'm going to divide that by 365, and this is how much money I've saved. Well, actually, that doesn't make any sense, does it? Because what are they, firstly, salaries vary quite substantially. If you're looking at certain countries, they may not be that high, and then you have to go and think about what the clinician is doing in that extra time that you've saved them. If they're going and doing 5, life-saving operations, then so it can be difficult. Actually, I think that's one of the challenges.
Yeah, I'm going to switch to Dominick. And Dominick, you're working with a large pharmaceutical company. Like, how are you going to convince the corporate executives, if anything?
Yeah, I think I would build a little bit on what Dr. Shruti said, because I think part of what she's saying and how I really translate that is that there really is a value chain for ROI. So it really depends on who you are and what you're measuring. So there's a value chain that goes from the patient, or what I like to actually say for people, for the end user or for the end experience. There's also, and that goes from the very beginning, from the actual company to the clinical research, and you can measure and calculate ROI on a number of different metrics throughout. Kind of the market validation point that I like to point to is from the US 𝐉𝐨𝐲𝐬𝐿. I think 𝐉𝐨𝐲𝐬 had the clearest value story that you could create out there because they told every employer, hey, we will save you money. And so that kind of a point made it easy for MedTech or for digital health companies to essentially recreate this, this value chain or to recreate this conversation. So, you know, part of the work that we do at Bayer, you know, when we're looking at ROI, what we do is investing and we're really looking at scalable platform companies. So we're looking for companies that can essentially work across geographies, which I think is hugely important. Something that you will hear me say probably repeatedly on this panel and throughout is all healthcare is local. So even when we have AI solutions, how can we break outside of those boxes? So again, I think that now, especially with digital health or MedTech being 100% year over year, we have a number of market validation points where you can essentially tell your unique ROI story. And I think that's much more compelling to the marketplace.
ROI, ROI, ROI. Interesting. You got me thinking there, Dominic. JP, from a local perspective and possibly even beyond local, thoughts?
I mean, when you're talking about a health economics, digital health economics, I'm speaking from an applied economist perspective, and I had also a valuation practice at 𝐂𝐶ED. One of the key problems over here is, as the other panelists rightly mentioned, is always measuring the outcome or the impact, right? And this is where I would say economics becomes much more useful when valuing digital health projects than normal financial analysis. The reason is that in economics, we look at what are known as the opportunity costs, the shadow pricing, the impact. So for example, we've just concluded a study for the Maltese government on the impact of digital transformation on productivity. And over there as well, you start having a number of metrics whereby you can start taking assumptions based on clinical data, patient data, to try and start modeling. But I think from a valuation perspective, if we're looking at the corporates or the startups in digital health, I think the most important perspective to measure is always the market fit and the market size. Because as Dom was mentioning, companies are after scalability. And you really need to try and assess the speed of that scalability. But more importantly than that, it's the total addressable market, the serviceable market, and then always taking assumptions based on that. But ultimately, from an economic and then from a financial perspective, it's the market that drives and how that particular technology or company actually fits in the whole grand scheme of that market or that problem that it is trying to solve.
We're talking about market, but something which really strikes me at the end of it all is the socio-economic status. Looking beyond just, addressable market, how much money I'm going to get from this, because also when we measure value in healthcare, we're also looking at value-based outcome as well. And sometimes that's really challenging because, like, okay, maybe the patient will get better, but how much money I'm going to make? So I want to bring in Shruti to this question, who seems to be extremely passionate about this topic, and I love that because it's so important, even when you're looking at social determinants of health even. They have an impressive role here. But tell me more about this, Shruti.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important topic because especially when we're rolling out these massive digital health and AI solutions, it's a double-edged sword. There's two ways we can go. And the first is, it can actually have huge, enormous benefit for people who are either in deprived areas, don't have access to healthcare, it's resource poor, which means that bringing in something like an AI tool to essentially help with diagnostication or even, reducing clinician workloads so they have more time to just see patients or actually even targeting the right patients. So there's huge value. But the other side of that sword is that if we don't do it correctly, we open up a lot of biases and inequality. So what I mean by this is specifically something that's termed data inequity. And what happens is people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or deprived areas have less access to care to begin with. So there's less data about them in the system. Secondly, the hospitals around them presumably don't have as fancy EHRs.
Yeah.
So again, less data about them. And then thirdly, they're not going to have access to a fancy iPhone where they have lots of digital health apps that they're putting, again, all their data. So essentially, what you're then developing is not targeted for them. It's targeted for the people that can afford all those things. And because of how AI works, it's only ever going to be as good as the data that you put into it. So it's not going to be tailored to these groups of people, unless, of course, we change that.
Yeah, in fact, I want to put this forward to the other panelists. Is there some simple way to tackle this inequity?
Well, I want to kind of maybe bring the last 2 points together because, what JP was talking about, every single startup deck has total addressable market, has these really big numbers. I looked at a deck this morning, chronic disease burden worldwide, $14 trillion by 2030 from the World Economic Forum. What does anyone do with that, right? And so what we don't see in these decks is the social determinants of health aspect. And we don't see this health equity aspect, actually, which I think is it's a huge opportunity, and it's something that a lot of companies are really missing. At the same time, it's really valuable that this aspect is built in from the beginning into the DNA of a company, because this, again, will eventually suggest scalability. It will suggest pricing and pricing models, because I think what we see right now in early companies, every single MedTech, digital health, or digital therapeutics company, they're charging $100, €100 a month for their solution, which is often a consumer cost. Yeah. So how do you kind of balance those things when really the healthcare need is in a different socioeconomic bracket often?
Yeah. JP, thoughts?
Yes, as well, if problem with most of the decks is that they're targeted purely from a typical financial analysis. Whereas what you're looking at when you're talking about health, given its public good qualities at the end of the day, is a much broader socioeconomic impact. And that is where, again, the beauty of economics comes in, that you can really start determining tangible economic impacts and outcomes, but also from a sociological perspective. In fact, there are numerous studies. Malta is also conducting quite a thorough on social determinants of healthcare. And then even economic literature points to a number of shadow pricing, impacts, costs, and all of that. So when ideally, and I totally agree, what we should start seeing in these decks is more of an economic impact assessment of the technology. So what are your direct impacts, what are your indirect impacts, and then what are your induced impacts as well on different strata of societies based on a number of studies that are already out there in the open. So I think if we're talking from a valuation perspective, right, especially for startups, valuation is both an art and a science. Right? And I think the onus is on both the startups, but more importantly on the valuation advisor, to not solely rely on the scientific point of view, on the sort of financial analysis, but more importantly using their judgment to make sure that that technology that they're putting forward or they're trying to value ultimately answers a healthcare problem, a healthcare issue, and that is adequately answered as well from a financial point of view and an economic point of view.
In fact, one of the things that really struck me is that first we kind of saw it as a doomsday issue, the fact that we're not reaching these populations, but then somehow all of a sudden Dominick said there's an opportunity.
I look at challenges as opportunities.
Yeah, it's great, but I want to kind of build on top of that. Because you mentioned there is the analysis aspect, there is the opportunity aspect, there is the reaching out to all these different population, different audiences, because they affect the data and they also affect the value. But at the end of it all, it's all about communication.
Yeah.
It could be a presentation, it could be a budgeting cost. Like, how do we communicate that? Especially when in an age where Malta is great because it has such a comprehensive set of basket of services when it comes to reimbursement. That means that if you go to the hospital, you don't have to pay like a ridiculous amount of money. You're going to be taken care of. And that's extremely important. So how can we give that same level of reassurance in digital health, be it a digital therapeutics framework as we've seen in Germany, but how can we see that same level of reassurance and at the same time communicate the financial value and long-term value of sustainability of this? We'll start off with Shruti again, if that you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I think, again, I'm going to go back to something I said at the beginning, and I think it actually comes down to how are we measuring and reporting these outcomes? Because right now, a lot of there's lots of research coming out, studies on AI, like literally every day, there's at least 10, 15 big studies that come out. But a lot of them are not actually being tested in a real world clinical setting. And the issue with that is, things are very different in a hospital where you have hundreds of factors that might potentially be confounding that are just not going to be there when you test it in a perfect computer environment, right? So we need to be looking at those real world outcomes. And hand in hand with that, going back to something you said earlier, Stefan, the concept of value-based healthcare delivery, which is essentially a concept that, okay, well, we need to look at patient outcomes, and then based on that, you're essentially deriving the value. And the only way to really focus on that, again, is to measure these outcomes effectively.
Dominick.
I don't know. For me, it's all healthcare is local, right? And the number one predictor of health is your zip code. Everyone knows that Harvard study from such a long time ago. And so, even what JP said, healthcare as a public good, I think that, again, depends a little bit on healthcare sovereignty. Because in the US, I think many people would argue that, and they would say, well, you have insurances, and then insurances also have moral hazard aspects to them. So I think in terms of communication, kind of to your original point, in healthcare, you have to be very audience specific, and you have to really segment your audience to really, I think, deliver the right message at the right time in the right way. Fortunately, we have AI that can maybe help with some of that. But I think that's how you do it, essentially.
JP, how does seed fit into all of this?
In terms of ultimately healthcare, I think we need to go down to the very basics of it all and remember that at the end of the day, we're dealing with people, we're dealing with lives, and we're dealing with health outcomes. So apart from the financial element, that is why usually in coming together for valuation exercises, you then have a multidisciplinary approaches to try and discount numbers from a clinical perspective, actuarians to try and give the span of life or the impact on life, modeling, and then even more discounting. So I think if we had to go back to the basics of as well economics, at the end of the day, it is not only a mathematical science, but at its heart, it's a philosophical science. And I think we need to always keep in mind that we're dealing with humans, we're dealing with lives, and the impact spans well beyond the dollars, the euros, and the pounds.
So I have a challenge for you, okay? You've got 1 minute, all right, to convince. We're going to have the Minister for Health soon, but let's go for the CEO of your company, all right? You have 1 minute. What would you tell your CEO to bring out the value of your digital health intervention, be it AI? let's make it a bit more, let's play a bit here, you know, like there's an opportunity. How in that 1 minute would you communicate the value? Let's go for it.
All right, I always like a good challenge. So I think the key thing here is whatever AI we build, I think we have to build it in a way that we eliminate bias. And when I mean bias, you know, whatever biases are there in historical data, whether it be racial bias, socioeconomic bias, we need to eliminate that from whatever model we build. So an example I can give is something that we actually built at Deloitte called 𝐂𝐞𝐝, which is the Rapid Intelligent Triage Assessment. And essentially, instead of going based on historical data alone, it literally assesses patients' referrals to specialty care solely based on their symptoms. So it's a natural language processing tool. And what that means is you don't have someone, you know, sometimes if a doctor sees a patient and they've come in with lots of what we call red flag symptoms of potentially cancer, but they're really young, they're fit, they're active, we might go, oh, it's nothing. But this won't do that. So it will literally say, okay, well, they have these symptoms. These symptoms, according to our pathway, correspond with malignancy or cancer. So we are going to put them in the appropriate clinic. And this is really important because you're getting rid of any sort of underlying biases that someone might have, whether it's age, gender, race, socioeconomic factors, and producing something that truly sees the patient and their symptoms for what it is.
Yeah, even like in basic research, age, sex, and race, sometimes they're known as the confounding factors.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
So, Dominick, your time.
1 minute, I think this is very easy in the biopharmaceutical industry. So this morning I read an article about �၀𝐞𝐝. They have a top line of 400 million. This is 3,000% growth since last year. 2, we all know about Livongo and their exit last year for 18.5 billion. They did what they did with just 100 people or a few hundred people, let's say. We have 100,000 people with probably just a little bit more of a fraction of a market cap than Livongo did. 3, drug pricing pressure, which all of this kind of happened after Martin Shkreli and Pharma Bro, but we've been dealing with that ever since. In order to make our stock and our share price a lot more attractive from a growth perspective, not a dividend play, we have to go in this direction.
JP, Videk.
I think it depends what technology and what audience you're looking at, but ultimately the discussion always revolves around the inputs required, the resources that you will free as a result of that investment, what outputs you can generate as a result of shifting resources elsewhere, and then finally, it's patient-driven, patient-centric outcomes and impacts on the broader society as well, but and then also keeping in mind the financial bottom line as well.
All right. So, quick 20 seconds, all right, because we can like round it off now. I'm pretty much convinced, I have to say, but maybe a bit more, you know, more time with you and then be even more convinced about the value. But 20 seconds, what you've learned from this session?
I think, you know, what I hope people take away and what I've taken away certainly is it's a complex process, but what we really need to keep in the back of our minds, or actually front of our minds always, is firstly, there's a patient at the end of all of this, and secondly, we need to be clear about, you know, that we don't want to perpetuate further inequality or biases. I think that's for me the biggest.
Are you Dominick 20?
This is maybe not from the content perspective, but I think it's been interesting to see the audience and what they respond to, what they react to, what they're taking notes on, and where they've been doing that.
Thanks. JP?
And I think ultimately it's about anchoring the discussion and valuation purely in patient-centric outcomes and not going for esoteric valuations which ultimately forget that we're dealing with human lives.
Yeah. If I may summarize, being realistic and being inclusive in the way that we measure value of digital health. Thank you, and with that in mind, I'd like to move on to the next item. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.